All right, Oseo, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to talk about this particular topic. I'm not too sure if you guys may have heard about this, but this is very essential to our people, especially dealing with the conversations about reparations. Should we be owed? How much is owed? Who should be paying? You know, I've been covering this topic for quite a while, especially back to the California Reparations Task Force. I was covering that topic during the topic of reparations around the so-called Black Lives Matter movement. And here's another one that's popping up in Washington, D.C. They're in the process of creating their own reparations task force, but this one is a little bit different. So I've been paying attention to it ever since it sprung about in 2020. But the ball got rolling in 2023. So I'm going to keep you up to speed, and I'm going to give you the updated information that I have that just recently was published to the public about this particular topic here in 2024. But let me bring you back to 2023, because some of you may not be familiar with this. I'm going to go ahead and play this quick clip. Here we go.
There's a new effort underway in the D.C. Council to pay reparations to people whose ancestors were slaves. It's an idea that's been met with controversy. Fox 5's Tom Fitzgerald live at the Wilson building today. And Fitz, there's two sides to this story here.
Produced by Dane Calloway and Tanisha Calloway. Watch this brand new documentary, Mother Rosa, right now at DaneMakeYouThink.com.
Well, there sure are. Councilmember Kenya McDuffie has now introduced this into the D.C. Council. It is called the Reparations Foundation Fund Act of 2023, and already this is getting a lot of reaction. What the bill would do is create a 9-member task force to study the issue. It would trigger the creation of a slavery-era database to identify descendants, and then create a Reparation Foundation Fund, which would then pay out to people who are found to be eligible.
I think that part right there is very critical to point out. The council member Kenya McDuffie proposed this idea, but that DC slavery era database, that portion right there, let's go back.
What the bill would do is create a 9-member task force to study the issue. It would trigger the creation of a slavery era database to identify descendants. Now,
I want to point that out because this is a little bit different from how the California Reparations Task Force did it. I remember I explained how genealogy is going to play a portion, not even a portion, a major role, okay, in them trying to discover what happened, what took place, and who was affected by it. See, this is another reason why those pan goofies have nothing to say about this particular thing as far as their attachment to reparations, because African Americans or Black Americans in that sense wouldn't be the ones who are owed, because the term African Americans and the term Black were not being utilized during the time period of slavery. And that was the main reason why I kept trying to stress that issue to people, to stop calling yourself Black and stop calling yourself African American, because technically it has nothing to do with you nor your people historically. Now, genealogy is going to be a major role, because they're going to have to discover what took place, what families were affected, and what group of people they are referring to. Now, the major issue here is that a lot of people were affected by slavery, okay? Not just the people of color. Okay, that's going to come up, because if they actually do their authentic research, in which I have, they will soon discover that it was more foreigners as slaves here than our people. Not saying that our people weren't enslaved, or the way I look at it is that the majority of the people that they were considered slaves were indentured servants. Everybody was working. There was not a point where people were working for free. That's another thing people have to understand. Okay, there was no way that a slave master would sit up and have employees work in their, whatever it is. It could be in the plantations, it could be on a building. They have to take care of themselves. Okay, they have to take care of themselves. It wasn't to the point where it was going by what the stories that we were told, like, oh, they were fed under the table by the family that, you know, that owned them, and they were living inside of a shack and stuff like that. All of that information is not verifiable. It's not. Those are just stories that were given to us in order for us to fill in the blank. They tried to make it seem as if we were the ones who were only enslaved, hiding the fact that there was more foreigners enslaved here in these lands by our people. Okay. Now, the reason why that's so important is because we're going to be owed more than just reparations. Okay. That's why that is so important. And I'm stressing the issue. Now, I know it's going to be many people out there that have no idea what I'm talking about, but I covered this topic in more detail and presented evidence and records, okay, by publicly verifiable sources to let you know that this is real. This is the real story of what happened here in America. Now, something that I'm going to be pointing out later in this video that's going to align with what I'm talking about, that's going to be exposing that particular portion where they're stating they're going to create a slavery era database. What they're going to expose, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Actually, I jumped ahead a lot, but I'm just going to talk about it right now because I'm excited. When they do this process of genealogy, because technically that's the only way that they'll be able to recover verification of or validate people as being affected by slavery during that time period. Now, is it only related to the people that migrated to Washington, D.C.? I don't know yet. I'm still taking a look at that to see if that's going to be a requirement or a prerequisite. But updated news has been reported, came out, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second. So let me finish up real quick.
And then created Reparations Foundation Fund, which would then pay out people who are found to be eligible for this. Now, this has been proposed in D.C., but what are people in D.C. talking about with regards to this? Fox 5 Gay's reaction today.
It probably would be a blessing to give them something.
If we were the ones who were the slaves, I would say no, because it has been so much time.
We'll see how it goes in 3-6 months. You know, they say one thing and then it just gets swept under the rug.
Now, what form that reparations takes may be up for debate or conversation.
However, critics say not so fast. Congress last held hearings on reparations back in 2019 when Democrats had control of the House. However, now in 2023, the GOP has taken over the House. And as you know, they've already moved to strike down D.C.'s controversial rewrite of its criminal code. Mike Gonzalez of the Heritage Foundation says if this bill were to get through the D.C. Council, it is very likely Republicans would move against it as well.
No, I mean, this is the D.C. Council again, putting in a bid for being the most leftist, woke city council in the country. I think that the more they realize that the U.S. Congress will stop them from doing really wacko stuff, the more they're going to do it.
It was a bit of a do-over. Councilman McDuffie introduced it originally back in 2020. However, it was not successful in getting through the D.C. Council. We're live at the Wilson Building.
So he originally, Kenyon McDuffie, introduced it in 2020. So I was aware of it then. And of course, they pushed it away, but it popped back up in 2023. Now I'm going to jump ahead and show you guys what's been happening. All right, here we go. Reparation effort for Black Washington, D.C. residents moves forward. Now that I'm reading the title, so apparently this has to do with the D.C. residents. Okay, but let me go into that. The D.C. Council approved a budget that allocates funds for a reparations task force. So it has been approved. This is Kenyon McDuffie right here. This is the council member that pushed it forward in 2020 and it got rejected. Now here it is. The Washington, D.C. City Council approved a budget for the next year that includes funds for Reparations Task Force scheduled to study restitution and to develop proposals to address the harms of slavery. The allocation makes Washington the latest city to develop legislation aimed at rectifying historical wrongs against Black Americans and their impact on their descendants. We're going to come back to that. The funding makes up $1.5 million of the city's $21 billion budget. Again, the funding makes up $1.5 million of the city's $21 billion budget, which the D.C. Council approved Tuesday, according to the Washington Post. The 2025 budget includes a provision directing the chief financial officer to allocate money for the task force. The legislation to create the task force is aimed at developing reparations for Black residents, quote, directly wronged and traumatized by the ills of slavery, Jim Crow, and structural and institutional racism. The bill reads, it also requires the Commissioner of the Department of Insurance, Securities, and Banking, that is very important, to create a slavery-era database of slave-holding records, including life insurance policies on enslaved persons. Now, actually, my wife and I have a book out right now called Fixing America's Broken Promise, because I know I put it out on video format, but I know in full detail, we put it in book format as well, where we went over the banks and the life insurance policies that acted like banks. I meant to say life insurance companies that took out policies on particular people that were hired, who we're going to call enslaved people, okay? But that took out insurance policies on people that these so-called slave masters hired. But technically, this is how you know slavery was all about employment, because still to this very day, that happens right now, where an employer would take out an insurance policy on an employee. Something happens to the employee, that's nothing but a write-off for the employer. This is still happening to this very day. No matter if you've been paying on it or not. Like say, for example, you have Blue Cross and Blue Shield as your life insurance policy carrier. You got that through your job. It doesn't matter. Still, regardless, your employer has life insurance on you. Now, in certain cases, you're never going to know that because the employer withholds that information. We discovered that this information is true because a lot of those companies still exist today. And this is what the information that we have inside of the book, Fixing America's Broken Promise. Many of them were banks, okay? And the insurance companies that we're familiar with today are Aetna and Fannie Mae Foundation. Those are the two life insurance companies that pulled out policies on employees. The great thing about this is that this is going to expose the banking system, but the problem with that is who they got. It says that it also requires the Commissioner of the Department of Insurance, Securities, and Banking to create a slave-era database of slave-holding records, okay? Now, could we trust them? I'm not exactly sure that we can, okay? Because that is like the enemy going to go tell on itself. We need, and I'm gonna state this again, I know I stated this before, but we would need the government to come clean. They need to know that they are a part of what happened. They are to blame on what happened. They need to be held accountable. This is the reason why I said a lot of us need to get together to start up a class action lawsuit against them. We should not allow Congress to sit back and go task for task, meaning task force after task force. We've seen this numerous times already where they needed to go back and study situations. They don't need to do any of that. And here's another thing. This also exposes genealogy DNA testing, because genealogy DNA testing cannot verify if your ancestors were enslaved or not. Okay? They also cannot verify where your ancestors came from. The reason why is because those papers that they send back to you, is that they call your results, won't ever tell you the complete story. They allow you to make that determination based off of the information that they give you. You're 24% of that, 10% of this, and 5% of that, when they actually have no clue about your deceased family members, because they cannot dig up your deceased family members and test their remains. But what does exist are these records. So now they have to create a slavery era database of slave holding records. And what I've been telling people ever since I hit the internet, ever since I came up on the scene, I've been telling people that genealogy is the most important factor here. It really is. It truly is. Because if you don't know who your people are, then you're more liable to sit back and let strangers do the talking for you. For example, if my ancestors went through a form of slavery, that does not mean that their condition, my ancestors' condition, will be worse than the next person's. That does not mean that it would be better neither. But the only way that will be validated, the only way that can be validated is if you know for sure. You don't sit back and let them create a slavery era database on these records without you having possession of at least copies of these records. There's no transparency. So they can come up with anything. And I know most of you are going to be like, the older people are going to be like, well, so what? We're going to get something out of that. If that was the case, you would have got something a long time ago. A long time ago. And it's always just the first step. This is just the first step. The bill was introduced by the council member, Kenya McDuffie, last year and discussed at the public hearing for several months afterward. In a racial equity impact assessment, the council's Office of Racial Equity conducted historical research, and offered recommendations to understand the bill's impact on Black residents. Quote, we can never fully capture the horror that was inflicted on Black people by white enslavers or the governments that supported them, the report reads. And I'm gonna tell you right now, you're gonna also find that it just wasn't Caucasian people who were the enslavers. The so-called enslavers had no set skin complexion, but who we really can point the blame on is the government. The government implemented taxes on the employers, AKA enslavers, AKA slaveholders, right? Made them pay taxes on property owned. Think about that. Is an employee property to an employer? Would an employee be considered property of the employer? Here's an example, real-time example. Let's just say you're in a managerial position at Walmart. That means that you're still an employee. You're still the employee. If you're in a managerial position and you act up, you do something out of the ordinary, not to the standards or policies that they have in place at Walmart, that goes viral on the news, you're going to be held accountable. And so is Walmart. Walmart is going to fire you, right? Are you not property of the employer? You signed a contract. Are you signing the contract to become property of the employer? Think about that. The same situation is still ongoing right now. The problem is that this is going to affect everybody, not just so-called Black people. But I encourage people to do their genealogy because we're going to get old. We're going to be owed way more than some form of restitution, way more than some form of reparations here. Because the majority of the people that look like me are going to discover that their families that have not been infiltrated with any drop of foreigners' blood, that they were the majority here in these lands. And they held positions like landowners, sharecroppers, business owners, bankers, lenders, creditors. I'm talking about even positions in the government, political positions, high-ranking officers in the military. But the landowner part, we got to get back to that because, people think, I'm not going to lie, this is a great thing because if it actually happens, this is going to expose the government. But think about that. Is the government going to be working towards exposing themselves anytime soon? Unless the public points that out. And even if we do point that out, what's going to happen? For example, right now, let me show you this. These are the reactions of Biden's team when he called Kamala Vice President Trump.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president because I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one. The fact is that
this just happened yesterday, by the way.
The consideration is.
So the reason why I'm pointing that out is because if the government is not going to take responsibility and embarrassment as president right now, he needs to step down, and everybody knows it. Alzheimer's, look, whatever, make up any excuse you want. He should not be a representation of the United States of America. But they're not taking responsibility for that. If the government can't take responsibility for the mistake that they made by allowing a person that is not in condition to run a country as a representation, as one of the main figures, historical figures that represents the United States of America and its government and its people, they can't take responsibility for making that mistake by keep allowing him there. Mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. It's just excuse after excuse and excuse after excuse. What makes you think that they're going to step forward and say, okay, they were wrong and they need to stop paying reparations for the people that they hurt during the slave trade era? And I think y'all look foolish calling yourselves by abbreviated terms, ADOS, FBA. That's silly. You're doing our ancestors a disservice, just like we're doing our ancestors a disservice by referring to ourselves as Black, referring to ourselves as African Americans, when that theory of everybody came from Africa, our ancestors were captured from Africa, has never been proven and won't ever be proven. Some of y'all look so foolish. This is the reason why they don't have no attention directed your way. This is the reason why stuff like this could fly up under the radar and nobody has heard of it. McDuffie told the Post that the budget allocation is only the first step, but that, quote, having the funding included in the budget to establish the creation of the commission to do all the research that's going to be required to develop potential proposals is absolutely critical to moving it forward. So they're looking for funds, right? Did they have to look for funds to aid Ukraine? This was 2024, May 2024. Look at this chart. U.S. gave Ukraine $175 billion from 2022 to now 2024. 2 years. $2.9 billion humanitarian support, $34.2 billion budget support, and $69.8 to their military. This is the Council of Foreign Affairs, or Foreign Relations rather. This is ridiculous, but yet they need to constantly study what happened with us. However, HR 40, by the way, HR 40 happened in 1989, a federal bill to create a commission to study the effects of slavery, reintroduced more than 3 decades after it was first introduced by Representative John Conyers, stalled in the House of Representatives after the House Judicial Committee passed it in 2021. It doesn't matter what you do. Nothing comes out of it. Several members of California's Legislative Black Caucus launched a statewide tour to promote 14 bills to address historical racial wrongs in the state, including 2 constitutional amendments proposed for this year's ballot. California efforts at reparations began with a task force that compiled an 1,100-page report. Y'all remember this? Over 2 years, including a method for calculating financial compensation. Nothing was done. No word back. Nothing. In 2021, Vanston, Illinois became the first city to implement a reparations program to address discriminatory policies from 1919 to 1969. By the way, that's not slavery era. They said that slavery was abolished in 1865, right? The program provides $25,000 to Black residents directly affected by or whose ancestors were affected by practices like redlining. Now, that's something different. Redlining is not the same as slavery. Redlining is straight up a discriminatory act in which it happens throughout every single state when it comes to buying houses, buying land, the taxes that you pay, no matter who you work for. I'm talking about the tax that comes out of your check. It's based upon where you live. That's redlining. I have a whole documentary about redlining. It's called Gentrification. That's on the website right now. That entire film, well, yeah, I couldn't keep it on YouTube. YouTube had a problem with that. So that's on the website. It's called Gentrification. I suggest you check that out. They said that it already issued payments to at least 129 Black residents, faces a lawsuit from a conservative activist group that argues that the program violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. What? The point is, are we going to call this results? A city in Illinois, 129 people getting $25,000? That's results? Ukraine getting $175 billion in 2 years is results. They didn't have to study nothing. Y'all need to wake up. And I always explain what we should do. This has gotten out of hand. Story after story after story of this happening. These Congress people are just latching onto our people's needs. That's a sales pitch, ladies and gentlemen. Latching onto our people's needs to keep themselves in office. And it doesn't matter their skin complexion. Of course, they're going to use somebody that looks like you and I. Of course. To make it seem as if they're going to get something done. Of course. Name one thing the Black Caucus has done. Name one. California's legislative Black Caucus. Name one thing. Where's the results? HR 40 has been around since 1989, and can't one person tell us any great results from us asking for reparations, because all they do is stop at trying to study. How long are you willing to wait for your enemy to state that they're responsible? How long are you willing to wait? If you don't smell a coffee, I suggest you go downstairs and get a little closer. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up.
I'm just here to make you think.
Slow down. Yeah. Sub up, like up.